Dear guests and colleagues, my name is Pavel Slunkin, and I'm happy to welcome you to the discussion related to the policy paper that has a name, Analyzing European Perspective for Democratic Belarus, Views from Experts on Belarusian Democratic Forces. The event is organized by the Institute for Development and Social Market in Belarus and Eastern Europe. Before we switch to the presentation of the paper, let me just briefly outline the structure of today's discussions and just technical details for your information. We will start with welcoming words by the organizers and partners of the paper. Then we'll let the authors of the paper introduce it. After that, we will welcome expert comments and feedback, and we will end with a political section. And now, let me yield the floor to the executive of IDS&B, Dzmitry Kukhlei. Dmitry, please take your floor.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you at our webinar, which is dedicated to the Analyzing Europe policy paper, Analyzing European Perspective for Democratic Belarus, Views from Experts and Belarusian Democratic Force. So this paper summarizes our roundtable dedicated to the European perspective for Belarus, which took place in November 2023, in which a wide range of Belarusian experts and representatives of democratic forces participated. So, after the 2020, the diplomatic relations with the Belarusian regime were stopped by the EU. It was because of repressions against the democratic society, and also because of the regime's participation in Russia's war against Ukraine. But thanks to the efforts for the democratic forces and their unprecedented support from the EU, though these forces declared a strategy for a European integration of for a democratic Belarus. So the main objective for democratic forces is to join the EU, and on the second conference for a new Belarus in August 2023, this goal was recognized. For many Belarusians, this membership in the EU has a distant perspective, especially in the context of the war against Ukraine and also repressions. No, but when we look at Central Europe or Baltic states in 1980s, they were in more or less same situation. But during these times, experts, intellectuals from these countries already formulated their goals. They thought about their return to Europe, and their efforts were not fruitless. We see their results using the example of Baltic states and Poland, other countries being members of the EU. So this work is very important for the Belarusian civil society, but also for other interested states and partners from Europe. So our event became possible thanks to the financial support and logistical support of our colleagues from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and I would like personally to thank its director, Jakob Wöllenstein, who is present there, and I give floor to Pavel Slunkin as well.
Thank you, Dmitry. And now my function will be just passing the floor from one speaker to another one. So now I'm happy to invite and introduce you Jakob Wöllenstein, who is a director of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Belarus. Jakob, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pavel. Thank you, dear colleagues, for having me at this conversation as a follow-up to the very useful and good November workshop we had, and all this undertaking which you are engaging in is something which we are very likely not just to support financially, but also with all hearts and minds. I saw that in your paper you make reference to the example of West Germany being the lighthouse example that during the time of the Cold War was able to influence and win over people not only in the eastern part of the divided country, but even further than this. And so as a foundation that has the name of Konrad-Adenauer in its name, this is particularly close to our hearts, since Konrad-Adenauer is credited with the so-called magnet theory, that the West, the free democratic world, which geographically was the West, has to be so attractive and strong that the people are going to be the ones in the Eastern communist countries who want changes in their lives. Now, unfortunately, we see that the people of Belarus don't have a say in anything at this moment. We saw the so-called elections on Saturday and Sunday with the early voting, which for the first time in history was officially declared to be higher than on the actual voting Sunday, which shows again how a dictator who even mobilized the air force against his own people is frightened of his own people, and this sets the tone for the time to come. So I think as much as I think we have to agree that at the moment the European political perspective is something which might be at least in the medium future, it is still super important to work on this topic, to make it as concrete as possible, and especially to work on when we talk about the Western direction, and the recommendations are mostly formulated, I think all of them are formulated towards the European Union, to work on what we like to refer to as the Eastern extension of the European mindset in the present-day European Union, to make sure we have a firm place in our mind and on our mental map for Belarus as a European nation that we want to see return to the European family of nations, not something where a country is becoming European, but where it is returning to its identity. And this is what we hear from those people, from the Belarusian people who have their say and can speak freely. So this is very much appreciated. I think it's overdue to work on this, and it should not be a question of when these changes will happen, but the changes in our mindset can happen right now. And I would like to congratulate you on having formulated a list of recommendations. And as we agreed earlier, since the time that is reserved for my welcoming remarks is pretty long, I would like to also use that floor that I have right now to jump into a few comments. I mean, chronologically, it would make more sense to have the full presentation of the paper, but I believe everyone has received the paper. Is that correct? Not only the panelists. So people have had a chance to study and read, so I'm not spoiling any secrets when making these recommendations. Recommendations not just based on my emotional reactions, but also on some time that we've been also trying to work in this direction, formulate recommendations towards the European decision makers. And one first thing is that I would recommend you to include a bit more pointedly is making reference to pre-existing documents. We had that once, that experience that we formulated recommendations towards European decision makers, and they said, well, we already have all those things. Why are you trying to tell us something that we already know? So by pointing out, well, with regard to the Council conclusions, A, B, C, D, people see that we actually studied what they do, and then we want to move them further. Or, and I think this matters, there are several examples when the intended goals that we see on paper, especially when it comes to sanctions, are not fully realized because of a lack of consistency in the realization. So if we say, we quote the Council conclusions, and then we say, in order to fulfill that wonderful goal that you have, you might have to do A, B, C. I think this is something which grabs people by what they already self-declared. A second general feedback would be that the recommendations often speak about the EU as a whole. But as you all know, the EU is a lot. It's different institutions in Brussels, and then it's all those member states. And if you say the EU should do ABC, it's very easy for people in the decision-making or the Brussels bubble to say, well, it's not us. I've heard that in terms of feedback from conversations that we had with Belarusian partners that took part in the strategic dialogue with the United States, and then with the European Consultative Group. And they said, in the US, it was much clearer who has responsibility to deliver. And in the European Union, not always people seem to know who is actually there to provide results. So I think if those recommendations could be more precise in saying, we see the European Parliament already said ABC, but then in order to implement this, we might have to have, for example, this envoy. Where would he or she be actually positioned in the system to have some leeway and to be able to implement those ideas? So more precise, more differentiation, also in terms of that the EU is not just Brussels, but all those member states. You make reference very rightly, I would say, to Hungary at some point. But I think strategically working on some of the member states, forecasting where there might be frictions. We discussed that at a workshop that had a similar topic in Warsaw last year. Victoria Liabedzka, for example, you were also there, and we discussed that at the moment it seems the advocates for a European integration of Belarus are more to be found in the east of the Union, so Poland, Lithuania, and so on. But if it comes, or when it comes, it's hopefully just a matter of time, to the actual negotiation process, we see right now the farmers and their lobby in Poland is very much concerned with Ukraine. What could be grievances in this part of the European Union to the actual accession process, and might we want to work on those target groups already right now? Because I remember at our workshop in Warsaw, one of the experts said, in the future it might be easier for Spain to agree than for Poland, because you have all those practical questions. So again, a differentiated approach that not some of these formulations already said the EU should do ABC. And this is like a segue to the next point. I think formulating it by the EU might want to do, formulate the European Union's interest and say, why is it that Belarus will benefit you? If we have this integration process in the future, that will be to the benefit of the European Union, because Belarus brings a lot to the table. And it's not only that in the distant future that will be nice and you will have a return of investment, but I mean, it's an investment, first of all, working with the European perspective. It's something which is in our interest, and then point out why that is, but that this interest already creates added value right now when we enable the conditions for Belarusians in the European Union to do that job and to do what they're good at. So grabbing countries, institutions by their interest. This is one more overall thing. And again, saying what is already good now and not just futuristic. I was missing a bit the Belarusian business when it comes to this creation of added value, because I think this is something where it's very visible and valuable that Belarus has a lot to offer. Also, well, the labor market in the future, but already right now, when we say, and you recommend absolutely correctly, that the conditions should be made in the European Union for the Belarusians in exile to work, to have their residence, and to do what they're good at. Again, that the added value starts right now, but also that business, free, or just business, right? And entrepreneurship is something that creates capital for the Belarusian democratic movement in the future. The 2020 moment was when activists, human rights defenders, politicians came together with regular people, businessmen, entrepreneurs, and said it's in the idea and the interest of the whole country to make that change. So I would emphasize, or recommend to emphasize business a bit more, both in terms of what it means for future Belarus, but also for added value right now. I'm just wondering, because my notes somehow technically not always showed up in the place where I wanted them to be, whether I missed something. Yeah, some details. I don't want to go into too many of the details, but on one paragraph, the fourth recommendation, it says, Belarusians who had to flee Belarus for political reasons. I will have to leave a bit earlier today because I'm invited to speak on the Lithuanian television tonight about Belarusians in Lithuania, which is a huge honor for me. And I think one of the topics will be who is actually here for political reasons. Is it only people who have asylum status and who can prove that they are on one of those sanctions, although those, what do you even call this, the extremists list in Lukashenka's Belarus? What about someone who says, I don't want to have a business in Belarus, my home country, which I love, but I don't want to pay taxes to that regime, so that's why I come to Lithuania? I would also say that's a political reason, but you don't see that in the visa passport, you don't see that in the migration office. So I think defining what political reasons are more broadly and try to lobby for a broader understanding of people's reasons, some not wanting to declare political refugee status for very good reasons. So I think this is something which matters. And then the new passport is a wonderful project, but I hear that we might have to put more emphasis on the very practical solutions that are already in place. And maybe one last comment or one last maybe also question back to you is on the 8th recommendation, which is about developing the new generation, of helping to educate the new generation of civil servants. In the text below, and I felt that was a few times the case with those recommendations, that the heading was a bit different from what you actually say later on in the explanations. Here you speak about reform plans, and reform plans are a wonderful exercise, and hopefully many of these reforms for constitution and for laws will be useful in the future. I think what you describe in the first sentence is what might even be the more practical thing to do now: expose people as broadly as possible to the practical impressions of how democracy and administration and all these things function in democratic countries of the European Union, because that experience, if you spend some time with an internship or whatever that could be, maybe just traveling and seeing institutions from the insides, I think these impressions might be something that would guide people in the future when you come to discuss those draft laws and so on, both in exile, but hopefully sooner than later in the Belarusian parliament, where those discussions will have to be had in the future. Maybe as much from my side on recommendations and comments, especially on that part. Again, you said in the text that recommendations are meant for the Belarusian democratic forces as well, but I felt like all those 10 recommendations were towards the EU. Maybe this might also be something to be considered, how the democratic forces might even become better and what they already do pretty well, which is the advocacy for all those topics in context with the European Union. Thank you, colleagues. I'm looking much forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Jakob. And now I'm inviting Andrei Yahorau, who is now Speaker of the Coordination Council, former political analyst, if I may, my colleague. So, Andrei, happy to hear you and happy to see you here.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I'm very happy to join this this call dedicated to the recommendations and the discussion about the European perspectives for Belarus. I believe that this topic is critically important, it's crucial for Belarus today. I also think that for Belarus, there is no other perspective apart from the European perspective when we think about the existence of Belarus as an independent and sovereign state. Belarus has no perspective to develop integration relations with Russia as it was doing. We can see the aggressive actions of Russia, which undermines Belarusian independence and sovereignty. I believe that in these conditions, Belarus has no perspective of neutrality. We have a very clear divide and geopolitical division between Russia, which is seeking to maintain its empire and to rule the neighbors and the free world, which sees itself in the light of international relations based on the rules between nations which define their political fate. I think we don't have a perspective, but many people dream about it in terms of historical nostalgia about regional unions, alliances, which could be a counterweight to the European Union, because there are no such perspectives as intermarium or a geopolitical union between Russia and the European Union, where Belarus and other former republics of the Soviet Union could also join in, or the former members of the Rzeczpospolita. So the European perspective remains the only road for Belarus when we talk about the preservance of Belarusian nation and Belarusian identity and its people. So we can only talk now how we can reach such a perspective. Naturally, the first problem is the non-democratic government. It's actually the authoritarian rule installed in the country. Without democratic changes, we cannot move forward on the road, on the path of becoming closer to the European Union. That's why today we need to think about the potential of changes and the potential of reinforcing pro-European attitudes in Belarus and the actions, what we can do today. On one hand, they are very clear in the sense that this potential is composed of people in Belarus, the potential of their self-organization, their civic action, independent of from the state existence, and their critical thinking and vision of the European perspective for Belarus. And with all those components, we should be working. The more freedom, the more free energy people in Belarus have, the better are the opportunities for changes. That's why we need to support cooperation and interaction in various spheres between the European Union and Belarus. Even if we have now limitations due to sanctions, we need to maintain possibilities for travel of Belarusians into the European Union and to strengthen and to give new opportunities for them in terms of visas, to support the initiatives in the sphere of education, cultural initiatives, so that they feel integrated into the European Union. We need to think about cooperation with Belarusian private businesses, which is not in many ways supporting Belarusian civil society. Belarusian business is creating a separate space because of sanctions and war. Belarusian business looks very toxic. So the creative ways of supporting this business and reducing this toxic nature are necessary, because otherwise it leads to a further dependence of Belarusian trade flows on Russia. This reduces and not increases the potential of our cooperation. Of course, we can also we can maintain the informational work with and make outreach campaigns with people inside Belarus in terms of explaining the perspectives of the European Union. The conditions are very harsh, the totalitarian conditions where information can be disseminated. Belarusians should have their fate linked with the European Union only after there's free flow of information, and in that situation they will have access to such discussions like we are having discussion today, to free discussions, and to be able to compare the perspectives that Belarus is facing. I will also note that the Coordination Council recently passed a resolution on the European perspectives for Belarus, which deals with various forms of cooperation, with political forces, giving status for political forces, Belarusian political forces, cooperation with the European Parliament, expansion of existing formats, also consultations on external aid that carried out by the Belarusian civil society with the European Union. We also should take into account the original formats of cooperation. In the first place, the Eastern Partnership initiatives. The movement of our neighbors towards European integration is influencing on the moods and the position of Belarusian citizens concerning the European perspective. So that's why it's very important to expand this kind of contacts through this mechanism of the Eastern Partnership. Eastern Partnership is remains relevant in today's situation. Thank you very much for organizing this discussion, and I wish all of us fruitful results of our discussion. I will stop here.
Thank you, Andrei. And we have one more speaker before we finally get to the presentation of the paper we are already discussing. So, Paul, please take your floor, and we are ready to hear your positive and negative remarks if you have them.
Thank you, Pavel, and congratulations to Rosa and to Victoria on a comprehensive and insightful paper on the theme of Belarus's European perspective. So my intention here is to elaborate on 3 points that I think from the paper that I think provide some fertile ground for developing policy from, and also 3 points where I think I would urge a little bit of caution. Some people will disagree, but I will mention them, and then I will conclude with some direct responses to 4 direct responses to the recommendations listed at the end of the paper. My first point reflects on the idea of EU strategy, which is mentioned at the beginning of the paper, as well as the Belarusian democratic movement's strategy. And I think here that the Belarusian side has some good opportunities to shape what the EU is doing. Paradoxically, for a slightly paradoxical reason. My thinking on this point stems from a comment that was made by MEP Juozas Olekas at a webinar that I hosted a few weeks ago. And he said the EU doesn't have strategies, it has policies. And indeed, from the paper, we get a sense of that. The Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung expert interviews, Martin Center expert interviews, it's mentioned that they bring up this idea that many experts agree that the EU strategy is inconsistent and agree on this fundamental point, which perhaps is that the EU doesn't actually have a strategy. And so this is very relevant because it undergirds how the Belarusian side engages with the EU. If there isn't a strategy, then you have a good opportunity for the democratic movement to shape what the EU is doing. It gives a lot more agency to non-EU actors and institutions, in my opinion. And I think the closest that the EU came to having a strategy in respect of Belarus was after 2014. In the paper, policy paper, you note that there were some benefits to civil society in that period up until 2020. Not for democracy, mind. And yeah, I think if you look at OSCE election monitoring reports for the 2019 parliamentary elections, they were very much soft pedaling on failings of democracy and human rights, these supposedly core EU, well, the core EU values, but broader Western kind of values that we embraced. But we have to also recognize that this wasn't so much a strategy for Belarus as the corollary of a strategy that the EU was pursuing towards Russia after the annexation of Crimea, rather than anything that happened in Belarus that prompted it. So my first point is that there's plenty of space to work on developing a strategy with the EU, and that's a positive starting place. My second point that I see as fertile ground for developing the EU perspective and EU ambitions stems from the recognition that it's quite a long path ahead. It probably also isn't going to be a straight path, But because by recognising that it is going to be a lengthy process, there's some room for trial and error. For many states that have acceded to the EU, the membership perspective has been the biggest kind of carrot that's induced reforms and improvements towards EU standards, whether that's technical standards or alignments with values. Now, if you have an exiled Belarusian democracy movement able to carry, bring some public opinion inside the country with it in coming closer towards integration into the EU, then I think that also gives a chance for the motivation for people inside who are still inside the country to try to push themselves for some reforms, and I think after it as its trading power, the EU's biggest influence, in my opinion, is when people are working towards integrating with it. And EU's current goals for Belarus, as described in the paper, promoting democracy, human rights, support for the people, these are all compatible with an integration perspective that you outline. The paper rightly, in my opinion, does acknowledge the question about where public opinion is inside Belarus itself. You quote a figure as low as 15% from one survey, which slightly surprised me, actually. Now, I know I was thinking here of an analogy with public opinion in Ukraine, and that's quite instructive on how public opinion can change. I was looking at some data from the Kiev Institute of Sociology, and in 2013, they found 49% of Ukrainians wanted to join the EU. If we jump forward 3 years to 2016, it had risen to 59%. Now, 3 years later again, it was about the same level. Another 3 years to the beginning of 2022, and it was up to 2/3 of Ukrainians wanted to accede to the EU. And then after February 24th, the number kind of shoots up to, I think it's 87%. So certainly opinion can become more favourable over time. But I do think that we should be careful, or people should be careful about assuming that opinion will swing in a particular direction. I'm very aware that I'm talking to you from the United Kingdom, and of my own cognitive bias here. Part of me thinks, why wouldn't anyone support path towards EU membership in the long term? But I'm acutely aware that my own country voted to leave the European Union. So while there are important points to be made about propaganda inside Belarus, about people not being free to express their views, etc., that what people might think is something in the future is something that needs testing rather than assuming. That's my second point. My third point is about what the paper says about Germany. The paper lacks an explanation as to why it focuses on Germany's role. I expect it might have something to do with where the workshops have taken place and funding, etc. But it's a shame, because I actually think it makes a lot of sense to shift to Germany. Jakob made the point that traditionally it's Eastern partners who have driven a lot of policy towards Belarus, Poland and Lithuania. And very obviously these attract a lot of hostility from the Lukashenka regime in Belarus. But it would be good to see some different states leading on policy with Belarusians and for Belarus. And so Germany is well placed to do that. I think it's something that might be pushed a bit more. It was quite heartening to read from the paper that there's some consensus among among German political parties on what their goals are towards Belarusians. I mean, that's not something that I would known about, but that's encouraging given how divisive many issues are in Germany and elsewhere in the EU. So those are the three kind of areas that I see as fertile ground. Couple of points to be cautious of. The first relates to the idea that enlargement is back on the agenda. So the paper quotes some technical points, referring to a presentation by Katja Glod at your workshop last year. And they seem sound to me. I'm not qualified to comment on those. I think in many European Union citizens' minds and governments' minds, Ukraine is going to be a priority in the future for membership. You do sound a warning note about populism. You mentioned Marine Le Pen potentially being the leader of France. I think there's more to be said here, and that you perhaps understate the risk here for this of populism. I'm worried about how a second Trump presidency might fan a wave of populism in Europe. Again, if I can refer to a state not in the EU, the United Kingdom, just because I'm far more familiar with the debate here than in a specific EU member state. Yeah, my sense here is that there's more of a willingness today than there was 8 years ago for people to publicly embrace Donald Trump as a prospective president of the US again. And that's a warning sign, because if the EU enlargement is back on the agenda today, can we be confident that it will stay on if around the world we start seeing a series of populist leaders elected? So I think you might understate the risk of the tide turning against enlargement. My second point for caution is the claim that concerns about Russia's reaction are based on an unfounded fear. So it's clearly true that after February 2022, Russia was pretty humiliated by its incompetence militarily. Its invasion wasn't very joined up. Its army, its navy, its air force didn't seem to be a cogent force. And they were beset by all kinds of problems. While I don't think that Russia is doing as well as Mr. Putin thinks in the war, in its invasion of Ukraine, I do think it needs to be recognized that it's dealt with a lot of its initial failings. When Russia intervened in Ukraine, NATO member states and EU member states had a clear military that they could give support to. If Russia were to occupy Belarus, what would happen? Why would a NATO or an EU member, what would they be able to do? How would they be able to help an opposition that is largely exiled from the country and which doesn't have an army? Tikhanovskaya has been very reluctant to endorse more militarism. And so if Russia does react, it's not clear who outside actors would be lending to support to help resist that, unless the Belarusian military defected en masse. But an uncomfortable thought, perhaps, is that the window of opportunity might have been March or April 2022. So this is really a point about dealing with the what if. What does happen to the European perspective if Russia does intervene? My third point for caution is really a point of clarification, I suppose. The authors referred to strategic and tactical approaches. So I understood this as a division into engagement with, trying to engage with society still inside Belarus, reaching into Belarus, working with public opinion, and the process of technical planning for the longer term. I think this is a helpful distinction, to my mind. Of course, both are necessary. As an outsider to the EU and to the Belarusian democracy movement, my anxiety would be that the strategic approach seems easier insofar as It's done in meetings with clear indicators for progress, and therefore the risk is that it comes to dominate. And personally, I think it's really important that people living in Belarus are engaged in the process. I would be inclined to say it's the more important of the two. So the question for the authors really is, where do you see the balance between these two different approaches, the practical and the strategic? So by way of conclusion, allow me to comment directly on some of the policy recommendations. You begin by saying the EU should continue its support, and actually this is something that Jakob has already mentioned, but I would add that Belarusian opposition and democratic movement maybe needs to help to articulate to the EU what its motivations are. And I would suggest that these are about European values and liberal ideas about shared values, promoting peace and security and prosperity for all. The recommendations talk about promoting the EU to Belarusians, which is well and good, but that will also, the better people see the EU, the greater the incentive to emigrate to the EU. Now, at some point, when the Lukashenka regime falls, and it will fall, it will be gone, how likely are the more people that have left that are outside of the country, how likely are they to return? How confident can you be that large numbers will quickly return to Belarus following a democratic regime change to democracy? Then you talk about the idea of a special envoy, which is, I think, a really good idea. I think Ukraine has perhaps been broken a path there as well by appointing a sort of ambassador at large for dealing with the Belarusian democratic movement. And you talk about EU communication to Belarusian citizens, which absolutely, I think, as I've said already, that is hugely important. But I would just stress also that communication to EU citizens, the reasons for giving support to a European perspective to Belarusians and to enlargement. Now, you touched on this in the last recommendation in the sort of the blurb, the paragraph accompanying the recommendation. I think it would be really good to actually see that elevated a bit more. It really needs to, I think it needs to be a recommendation in the future. That's something that I think people need to think about actually recommending directly rather than sort of burying it in the paragraph where it gets a bit lost. So the democratic forces of Belarus need to be working not just with Belarusian opinion, in my view, but also with EU member populations' opinion. So those are my kind of direct responses to your to the paper. I regret that I can't stay for too much longer because I have another event to prepare for. But I think it was a really good paper. It was really absorbing to read. So well done, Victoria and Rosa.
Thank you so much, Paul. As we have had a chance to fill these appetizers before we have even see the presentation of the paper, now it's a great pleasure for me to invite finally the authors of the paper, who are Rosa Turarbekova and Victoria Leukovets. Victoria is a researcher at the Stockholm Center for East European Studies. And
dear colleagues, finally, I would like to present a policy paper, which was the result of an analysis not only of the topic Belarus-EU from neutrality to integration, but also the opinions expressed by experts, diplomats, and politicians at the round table. Many of those who participated in that round table are here with us today. And you can see right now, first slide, I mean, title of this policy paper, and our some introduction. In August 2023, Belarusian democratic forces adopted an important document declaring a strategy for European integration of Belarus. Pro-European ambition of Belarusian political elite sends a strong signal and demonstrates willingness to end the era of geopolitical neutrality of Belarus, which has been promoted by the Lukashenka regime, to pull Belarus out of Russia's embrace and join the European family of nations. This is a crucial time for the EU to rethink and reevaluate its strategy towards Belarus. How has this strategy changed over time? Does it reflect the altered international environment after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? To what extent is it effective and sustainable, and in which areas can it be improved? This policy paper summarizes and analyzes the results of the roundtable discussion Belarus-EU from neutrality to European integration held in November 2023. The discussion was divided into two parts, expert and political. The expert panel analyzed the debate around the European perspective for democratic Belarus and discussed proposals for strengthening Belarus-EU relations. At the political panel, representatives of democratic forces outlined their positions regarding Belarus' potential membership in the EU and formulated their proposals for developing Belarus-EU cooperation in the future. Based on the speakers' presentations, 10 policy recommendations were developed for the EU strategy towards the Lukashenka regime, as well as EU's relations with Belarusian democratic forces and civil society. I give the floor to co-author and moderator of the first panel, Victoria Lukavets. Please, Victoria, you can share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Rosa, and thanks to the organizers for setting up this important event. Also, huge thanks to everyone for the introductory statements, in particular to Jakob and Paul for your insightful comments, which I will not be able to address now, but which I'm sure we will take on board, and hopefully if there is some time left, we will discuss them later during the event. So yeah, due to the shortage of time, I'll try to be really brief, and I'll structure my presentation in the following way. First, a few quick words about the background and main goal of the paper. Secondly, I'll present to you the key 5 sections of the first, which emerged from the first panel. And finally, after the second part of the paper will be presented by my co-author, I will take the floor again and speak a bit about the conclusions and recommendations. So let me start by saying that, as it has already been mentioned, the paper emerged as a result of the panel discussions, and it basically set a rather modest goal, just to capture the main contentious, polarizing issues which were expressed by the experts, but also political actors during the discussion. The idea was to capture them, to provide this snapshot in order to attract the attention of the policymakers and encourage them to take these ideas forward and hopefully make them as a basis for the future strategy towards Belarus. So let me now quickly take you through the 5 sections of the first part of the paper. So the first section focused on the overview of Belarus-EU relations, and it was largely built on the input from one of the speakers, Pavel Slunkin, who today acts as our moderator. And basically, this section discussed the different phases in Belarus-EU relations during the Lukashenka era, outlining the phases of rapprochement and tensions. It also discussed what was the major influence, in fact, that impacted the changes in these phases. The criticism was also raised vis-à-vis the EU's policy towards Belarus at this time, which was already picked up in comments by Paul. And finally, the section also underlined the main lessons, the lessons which the EU should try to take on board in developing its future policy approach. And the major lesson is that basically democratization in Belarus cannot happen as long as the autocrat Lukashenka is in power. As the history has shown, he did allow certain democratization, certain subtle democratization, if you will, before 2020, but all these attempts to sort of flirt with the democratic values and principles finished as soon as the dictator was directly challenged by people, Belarusians, and political opposition. Second section of the paper, it focused on the EU's approach towards Belarus, and basically it outlined the three main foundational principles which were voiced by Dirk Schubel. You can see them on the screen. They are protecting democracy and human rights, ensuring sovereignty, independence of Belarus, providing support to the Belarusian people. I will not go into too much detail here. They're pretty much self-explanatory, and you can read about them in the paper. What I would like to emphasize is that the EU has made a crucial commitment, has taken a crucial responsibility to support Belarus as long as it's necessary, as long as there are democratic changes there, and as long as the country is ready to become part of the European nation. Something else that I would like to bring to your attention is the EU Council conclusions on Belarus, the most recent conclusions which were adopted fairly recently, February 2024, and they reaffirmed the major statements of the 2020 conclusions and sort of made a strong, even emphasized a stronger commitment expressing the EU's unwavering support for Belarus's democratic future. Third part of the paper, that was an interesting section which provided this empirical data proving that there is a demand, the demand for EU strategy towards Belarus among the EU policy makers and shapers. The section was basically organized around the presentation made by Jakob Wöllenstein, very insightful presentation. And here on the slide, you can just see two questions from the survey, two key questions. And you can see that the response to the question whether there is a need for a strategic approach towards Belarus, 100% of respondents said yes, confirming this strong, high demand for the strategy towards this country. Interestingly enough, the second most popular answer to the question, what should be the main goal of the strategic plan for Belarus, the second most popular answer was preparing Belarus for EU membership, which signals that there is an understanding, there is a willingness on the EU level among EU policymakers to promote this European idea for democratic Belarus. This section also demonstrated the positive example of Germany, and I just to quickly agree with Paul's comments. Of course, it would be very useful also to add, the positions of other countries. Why Germany? Well, the section was built around the presentation by Jakob, and in his presentation, he just outlined, all these positive examples that Germany has done vis-a-vis democratic Belarus, and which certainly can and should be replicated by other EU member states. Fourth section, challenges to European enlargement. Due to the shortage of time, I'll just outline here these quick 5 challenges. I totally agree that some of them can be expanded, developed further, yet they sort of provide a quick snapshot of what is out there, of all these worrying trends. And they have already been mentioned by poll partly. I will just quickly name them. So the first challenge is the internal reforms that the EU has to do to accommodate new member states. The second one deals with the distribution of the EU regional funds and common agricultural policy. The unanimity principle is also can become a stumbling block on the way to successful European enlargement. Elections in France, but also in other member states, can jeopardize the successful implementation of European enlargement. And finally, ongoing war in Ukraine. That's also a crucial variable in the equation, which can impact the success of enlargement negotiations with the candidate countries, and also can impact the prospects for European perspective for democratic Belarus. So while the fourth section kind of covered these challenges concerning the European enlargement more broadly, the fifth section zoomed into European perspective specifically for Belarus, and it discussed how the declaration came about, what factors, declaration on the future membership of Belarus, which was adopted by the Belarusian Democratic Forces in August last year, how it came about, what factors contributed to it, and it also outlined the key arguments for and against the European perspective for Belarus. The arguments against include, for example, such statements as it's not the time yet, the war is going on, there are repressions in Belarus, it's really not the fruitful time to engage in such discussions, advancing the European future of Belarus. Opinion polls also provide the worrisome data. And of course, these arguments can be challenged. I unfortunately have no time to go into depths now challenging these points. I will just outline the main arguments for which were mentioned, and they are that Belarus is part of Europe. It has a strong historical legacy. It used to be a member of important European formations, together with Poland, for example, the Great Duchy of Lithuania. And most importantly, the Belarusian values are very close to the European values. This section ends with kind of an optimistic outlook that there is a chance for the window of opportunity opening in the midterm perspective, and therefore it's very crucial. It's the right time for Belarus to engage in self-identification and to start preparing itself for the democratic future already now. On this note, I would like to finish and pass the word to my co-author, and then I'll take the floor again for recommendations. Thank you. Okay.
And my part, you can see this picture, from our conference, conference New Belarus, and you can see a quote from the Declaration of Membership of the EU adopted by democratic forces, and you know that it will happen. It happened August 2023. And if we talk about second panel about positions and programs of the Belarusian democratic forces regarding the European perspective for Belarus. Also, the declaration on future membership of Belarus in the EU adopted as the second conference New Belarus represents a common position of the Belarusian democratic forces. There are several Belarusian political actors which explicitly or implicitly speak against the prospect of Belarus joining the EU. During the New Belarus conference itself, as well as in the media, skeptical assessments of the European prospects of Belarus were expressed by such public figures as Ivan Kravtsov, Coordination Council Secretariat, and Volga Kovalkova, Coordination Council member. Nevertheless, it can be stated that the overwhelming majority supports the main goal proclaimed in the Declaration of Future Membership of Belarus in the European Union. For example, a strong support for the declaration during this panel discussion was expressed by the representatives of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office, Valery Kovalevsky and Anatol Liabedzka, head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Coordination Council, Tatiana Marinich, representatives of the banned party, Hromada Hanna Kanyus, leader of the Christian Democrats and the movement of Belarusian Solidarity, Vitaly Rymasheuski, as well as a representative of the movement for freedom, Yuri Gubarevich. And you can see on this slide some division, division between strategic and tactical approach. And when we analyze positions of democratic forces actors, we can see these two different approach. I mean the strategic approach and the tactical approach. What I mean, the strategic approach means the preparation of draft reforms, draft association agreements and roadmaps with the expectations and goals of accelerating the accession into the European Union. The tactical approach means advocacy efforts for Belarusians, lobbying for an increased access to visas, cultural, educational, and professional exchange, support for grassroots initiatives of civil society. The division into two approaches helps to pay attention to the emphasis made by certain political actors. None of them have demonstrated a singular approach in their programs and visions for the foreign policy objectives of Belarus. There are different mixed approaches with the dominance of one or the other, depending on political capital, resources, functional self-identification, and goal setting of the actors. The strategic approach in its expanded form was demonstrated by representatives of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office. In particular, Valery Kovalevsky proposed three areas of work. First, work with the Belarusian society to explain all the advantages of joining the EU. Second, working with European partners to strengthen the narrative about Belarus as a European country. Third, institutionalization of relations with the EU through the creation of formalized groups. For example, a contact group with the EU, consultative group with the Council of Europe, the possibility of appointing a special representative of the EU for cooperation with the democratic forces. Kovalevsky indicated work on the draft association agreement as one of the main directions for bringing the European perspective closer, especially noting the complexity of work on the economic bloc. The tactical approach was largely proposed by those political actors who aimed to support grassroots organizations. In particular, Vitaly Rymasheuski expressed criticism of the strategic approach, deeming it to be a waste of time. Instead, he suggested focusing on lobbying for Belarusians for such things as mobility, opportunities, to do business and study abroad. He advocated for making this the foundation of the roadmap for cooperation with the EU, including support for cultural and educational initiatives. The results of this panel discussion represent a snapshot of the current foreign policy preferences among the Belarusian political forces. The electoral campaign to the Coordination Council, which is expected to take place in spring 2024, can serve as an important critical juncture for the Belarusian political elites to clearly define their programs and priorities, reflecting strategic and tactical approaches for the next electoral cycle. Thanks for attention.
So, based on the discussion that we had, we formulated 10 policy recommendations. Each of the recommendations, it has sort of includes a statement and also a more like an explanation or justification. In my presentation, I will try to group all these 10 recommendations into several thematic blocks or clusters, if you will, because for the time being, you know, they're a little bit dispersed. Some of them might be even duplicating one another, and they're kind of on different analytical levels. And once again, I would like to express appreciation of the comments which were voiced by Jakob and Paul for sort of streamlining and improving them. And of course, everybody else is most welcome to provide their comments as well. So the first cluster sort of focuses on kind of overarching policy towards democratic Belarus. And here, for the time being, we have two recommendations. One of them is more sort of of a declarative nature, and the second one is more practical. So the first one says that just EU should try to continue its support to Belarusian democratic forces, civil society, exiled Belarusians as long as necessary. And it's very crucial for the EU to kind of link, to emphasize the linkage between the future of democratic Belarus and Ukraine, to promote this narrative that the futures of two countries are interconnected, and without the victory of Ukraine, democratic changes in Belarus might be not even realizable. The second, more practical recommendation invites the EU, encourages the EU to introduce to appoint a special envoy for relations with democratic Belarus, who would coordinate the work of the national envoys and also just oversee the daily work related to this country. Second cluster was a rather challenging cluster, and it sort of deals with overarching policy towards the Lukashenka regime. And for the time being, we have here only one recommendation, which was voiced by some of our panelists, and we have slightly developed it further. But the idea of this recommendation is that the EU shouldn't close its doors completely, and should keep some channels of communication with the Belarusian elites in order to understand their moods and also to try to figure out who would be more susceptible to democratic changes and who would be more receptive of the idea of closer cooperation with the EU in the future. The target groups here can include the regional elites, for example, the case of Grodno, the classical example of the city in Grodno, which where both population and elites showed high anti-Lukashenko moods during their protests. This cluster, of course, can be enlarged. The amount of recommendations here could be enlarged. For example, it could be complemented with recommendations on sanctions against the Lukashenko regime. Third cluster concerns the European perspective for Belarus and the challenges of enlargement. And here we have three recommendations. The first one is that the EU needs to clearly articulate the possibility of European integration for democratic Belarus. The EU should try to invest in making this European perspective for Belarusians a more attractive alternative to the Eurasian choice, the Union State, the Eurasian Economic Union, which are promoted by Russia. And finally, the EU should really have a clear understanding of the overarching general challenges hindering the process of successful implementation of the enlargement policy. Basically, the EU needs to develop some countermeasures in response to challenges outlined in section 4 of the first part of the paper, if you will. So that was the third cluster. The fourth cluster, which is kind of related to the third, and yet we think it kind of deserves a standing of its own, people-to-people contacts. It's imperative for the EU to bolster opportunities for people-to-people contacts with Belarus, to enhance investments in such areas as freedom of movement, ability to work and study in the EU for Belarusian citizens. Finally, the fifth cluster, if you will, focuses on kind of specific projects for Belarus, specific thematic projects of Belarus. Many of our panelists underlined the importance of educational, that the EU should sort of provide more support for various educational opportunities for Belarusians, that the EU should invest into projects focused on preserving Belarusian culture, national identity, independent media. And an interesting suggestion was raised concerning this project aimed at sort of developing a new generation of Belarusian civil servants who sort of would become the main agents of change in the future when the European perspective for Belarus will be formulated and the process of Belarus accession to the EU would be on the table. So on this note, I would like to finish with this list of recommendations. Once again, this is not an exhaustive list. It is not a closed list. Of course, it's subject to improvements. It can be enlarged. Many of the points can be complemented with concrete measures, concrete policy steps, practical steps. And of course, any of your comments and suggestions on how to improve this list would be highly appreciated.
And now we will have an expert comment on what we have seen by Laure Delcour. She's an associate professor in international relations and European studies in the University of Sorbonne. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. There are many interesting points in the report, so I will just discuss 3 of them and focus on how a potentially democratic Belarus may get closer to the European Union, and then perhaps we can talk into greater details about other Eastern Partnership countries during the discussion. So the first point that I would like to raise relates to the past, meaning to the historical overview of EU-Belarusian relations. I would definitely agree with the report's main arguments in this respect, meaning the fact that EU-Belarusian relations have gone through ups and downs. For instance, a rapprochement could be observed between 2014 and 2020, followed by a new down after the presidential elections. I would also agree with the fact that the EU has been inconsistent and has oscillated between values and interests. So also with what Paul said on the fact that the EU has no strategy vis-à-vis Belarus. Now, what I would perhaps miss in the report, but also this falls beyond the scope of the report. If we go beyond EU-Belarusian relations, if we try to place them in a broader comparative perspective, then what is above all striking is their very embryonic nature, and it is obviously striking in comparison to other Eastern Partnership countries, especially the 3 candidate countries. So there is no partnership and cooperation agreement in force between the EU and Belarus, which is also, by the way, in sharp contrast to Central Asian countries. There is no association agreement, no deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. There is just visa facilitation and readmission agreement. So this means that from a purely contractual perspective, any relations between the EU and a future democratic Belarus would need to start from scratch. And yet, paradoxically, in my view, this would be easier and quicker for Belarus, because Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have charted the way forward for EU relations with Eastern Partnership countries. So, in a way, there is a model to be followed. So should the political regime change in Belarus, There is little doubt, in my view, that the country would quickly be offered a full-fledged participation in the Eastern Partnership, as well as the ratification of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement that was negotiated in the 1990s, plus probably the perspective of an enhanced contractual framework with an association agreement. Having said that, the fact that the EU and Belarus would have to start from scratch in their relationship has important implications as it raises very specific challenges on how the country can follow the same path as Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So I will now shift to my second point, meaning the medium-term challenges related to the to closer integration of future democratic Belarus with the European Union. And I will come back in particular to the debate on how to deeply integrate with the European Union and whether democratic Belarus should be strategic or whether it should be tactical, meaning that it should primarily seek to promote grassroots people-to-people contact with the European Union. As Paul said, and also judging from the experience of other Eastern Partnership countries, I would say that both matter. Just for the sake of comparison, Ukraine first expressed membership aspirations in 1996, and it took over 25 years for Ukraine to finally get the candidate status. And during these 2 decades, Ukraine became increasingly exposed to EU norms and also increasingly linked to the European Union in terms of trade flows, but also people-to-people contacts, whether in terms of education, business, research, or whatever. At the same time, Ukraine, like Georgia, has also been constantly vocal, except perhaps under Yanukovych, in asking for more than the EU was prepared to offer, meaning membership. So ultimately, what made the difference, in addition to the geopolitical context and Russia's invasions, is Ukraine's capacity to effectively reform. This made a clear difference for the European Union. Because Belarus has remained an authoritarian country without a proper market economy, it should definitely combine wide-ranging reforms and greater exposure to EU norms. And in my view, the latter is crucial, meaning exposure to EU norms. And I think many recommendations, such as those related to education, civil servants, people-to-people contacts, but also those related to media, making the European perspective more attractive, are important because they relate to what academics call socialization, meaning familiarization, getting familiar with the European Union. In my view, because Belarus has not been exposed to the European Union, the first steps towards deeper integration with the EU may prove especially complex, and this is also because the country has remained isolated not only from the European Union, but also from other international organizations over the past 3 decades. And this is perhaps another key difference with other Eastern Partnership countries. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia also, they all joined the Council of Europe in the 1990s and the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. And this is not the case for Belarus. However, the EU's association agreements are premised on the Council of Europe's conventions, and being a member of the World Trade Organization is a precondition to signing a deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement with the European Union. Accession to both organizations would therefore be a priority for democratic Belarus, and it is also a very complex process that needs to be factored in any strategy of deeper integration with the EU. One final word about another potential challenge before moving to my last point, meaning public support for EU integration. I would also echo Paul in saying that public opinion can change, and it has changed indeed in Ukraine. But I would also say that some countries have got closer to the EU while being extremely polarized in terms of public opinion and staying polarized. And I have in mind Moldova here. The Moldovan population is extremely polarized between, on the one hand, integration with the EU, on the other hand, integration with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. So, in my view, the current low level of public support for EU accession or integration with the EU is certainly not an obstacle per se. Now, moving to my third point on longer-term challenges related to EU enlargement. So, from the EU side, because enlargement is a two-way process, and the EU should do its homework and prepare for enlargement too. I would here perhaps disagree with Paul, who unfortunately has left, and I would say that definitely enlargement is back on the EU's agenda. However, it's very much of a moving target, and it is a very polarizing issue across the European Union and within many countries as well. So the EU should prepare to enlargement, and this entails reforming governance and decision-making, as was suggested in the paper, in particular in terms of dropping unanimity in key policies, such as the common security and defense policy. This also entails changing practices in the accession process, and especially reduce the power, the discretion of the member states in the enlargement process. There are two instances when member states have the possibility to stop the process. First, when they receive the application, and second, when they ratify the accession treaty. However, over the past decade, the EU member states have made an extensive use of veto power for issues unrelated to the accession criteria, and this has blocked the accession process of the Western Balkans, in particular North Macedonia. So member states need to engage loyally to make the process a success and reward those candidates that are actually conducting reforms based on accession criteria. So in this context, and this point is also raised in the report, seeking the leadership from some member states would be crucial to steer enlargement and Belarus accession. Democratic Belarus could seek to build a coalition of the willing, which could start with the Weimar Triangle, meaning Germany, France, and Poland, but also include other countries such as Lithuania and the Baltic countries. It is indeed important to include not only founding members of the European Union, but also countries that have gone through the EU's accession process and can share their experience. Finally, recent ideas on a broader reform of enlargement, and especially this new concept of staged accession, are promising for Belarus because they place accession in a longer time frame, and they offer the perspective of gradual integration with the EU. So I will stop here. In terms of recommendations, I would indeed, as was suggested during the presentation, group them into several clusters. I would also perhaps add a recommendation on the need to exchange experience with, and perhaps even get guidance from the Eastern Partnership associated countries, meaning Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Laure. And before we switch to the final section of the presentation of the event, the political section, I will read a review written by Katja Glod, who is an expert at the European Leadership Network and the Center for European Policy Analysis. She was unfortunately not able to join us today in person, but I think that this is important to let you know her opinion about the paper she also reviewed. So the policy, I start quoting, the policy paper provides many interesting insights on the domestic dynamics in Belarus, particularly with regard to the country's complex relations with the European Union and historical successes and failures. The varying views on European integration within the Belarusian democratic opposition forces, the complexity of domestic public opinion, and the survey of European officials are now new pieces of research and analysis that will be of interest and great value to Western policymakers. The recommendations chapter at the end is particularly noteworthy. At the same time, some important statements and recommendations would merit extensive explanation and illustration, in my view. For example, the visa or border crossings difficulties may be well understood by the exiled forces, but can be unclear to the Western policymakers or even interested domestic readers in Belarus. The points that would benefit from more examples are highlighted in the text. At the same time, cutting out repetitions would make the text more coherent and digestible. I would also recommend structuring the recommendations and paper itself in a different way. It is great to have the notes from the roundtable discussion, but I would group them into a separate section for those who would like to read them. I would recommend focusing the policy paper on the recommendations, which would also benefit from being grouped into separate subheadings with the introduction and conclusion as they are, and a very short summary of the roundtable discussion. That would make the paper punchier and more digestible. I think the link between security in Ukraine, the region, and democratic changes in Belarus should be made clear upfront. Importantly, I would encourage the authors to think about both a strategy and an achievable plan of action with concrete steps on how to raise better awareness and increase attractiveness of the European perspective within Belarusian society, which in my view should be the target audience. As it is, the paper lists disparate elements of a potential strategy, but they lack contextual detail and do not, in my view, directly address the question at stake. Would you comment something? Rosa, Victoria, would you like to comment?
Victoria, maybe you first?
Yeah, just very briefly. Well, first of all, thanks to Katja for providing these comments. I would like to just return to the things that I have already said at the beginning of my presentation concerning the very goal of the paper. Katja proposed us to develop a strategy per se. That was not the goal from the very start. You know, that would be a very tall order to fill, so to say. Our goals were much more modest. We wanted just to capture like the main points that were raised in the expert community, but also by the political actors, and try to bring them forward. So I think it's up for the political actors and the EU policymakers and shapers just to take a look at these policy recommendations and then take steps and perhaps develop the strategies of, you know, of their own. That would be perhaps more sort of the task on their side. We just, you know, summarized, captured the discussion, provided the analysis, and emphasized those things which, for the time being, are being actively discussed in the expert community and among political circles.
Thank you, Victoria. My comments closer to you, but I would like to thank Katja Glod for her critical analysis of the policy paper and suggestions for its improvement. I agree with number of comments. However, I would like to comment on some comments regarding the fact that the policy paper does not offer a strategy for bilateral relations. Yes, and I agree with my co-author, and we were not given such a task. Yes, rather our goal was to conduct an audit of the relationship and based on it offer a number of recommendations. And secondly, the description of the discussion could be separated into a separate part, and the recommendations could be expanded in more detail. The logic of our policy paper was, as stated above, not to propose a detailed plan of action, but to outline it based on an analysis of the experience of bilateral relations. A strategy for bilateral relations may not be the goal of one small 18-page document, but rather the result of a systematic analysis and large document authored by a large group of analysts, experts, diplomats, and politicians. This is the work of an entire think tank, and I think that maybe in future we can see such big document under title Strategy of the European Union to Belarus, or for Belarus. Thank you very much.
Yeah, also, Pavel, if I may, just several quick points. Having said that, of course, I think we can agree with many things that Katya raised in her review. For example, the thing that she underlined, that there should that this kind of linkage between the future of democratic Belarus and Ukraine should be made more pronounced. I think that's a totally valid point, and we absolutely take that on board. Or some of the things that she proposes to kind of elaborate on, develop for the European reader, for example, the question on the visa policy or any similar things that she kind of underlined in the text. Of course, all this is taken on board and will be implemented. Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much. And we have 25 minutes left, and I'm happy to finally start our final section, the political section, with impressions and reflections from politicians, from representatives of the Belarusian democratic movement. And we have in this panel Vital Rymasheuski, who is a former presidential candidate who participated in presidential elections in 2010, and he has been leader of the Belarusian Christian Democrats for many years. And Anatol Liabedzka, who is the CEO of the European Dialogue Center and advisor of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya on constitutional reform and parliamentary cooperation. Thank you for joining us, and I yield the floor to Vital, to you, for your impressions and reflections.
Many thanks. First of all, my special thanks for your huge work that has been done. I think it is very important work. I think that democratic forces would take this work, and this work would continue. And I think that major problem points related to EU strategy or EU policy or EU countries' policies or democratic forces challenges, they are mostly defined. So the recommendations are very important. They are updated and right to the moment. They show the problems that exist in bilateral relations. I would like to stress a few points that I've heard during today's meeting. They are very important. One of the first speakers mentioned that the EU strategy vis-a-vis Belarus is often developed in context with the Russian Federation, and it is a dangerous trend. Many EU countries repeat Putin's concept that Belarus is de facto part of the Russian Federation. So any strategy towards Belarus, well, sanction strategy or foreign policy strategy is perceived through Russia's prism. And it is a dangerous trend because it might lead to the end of our independence. And one should also mention that Belarus has the way towards the EU is two-way. It could be a way for rapprochement with the EU and so on. And during our previous round table, we mentioned that there should be also political integration, but also mental and economic integration, more context with our fellow citizens. These are issues that are very important. Integration, well, genuine integration is not possible without these changes. So we should do things, spread such things, unless otherwise we would fall in Great Britain's trap. So it is very important to have such a strategy. And for me, what is disturbing is that the Belarusian democratic forces are not so much centered or were working to keep ties with the Belarusian society. And well, unfortunately, we see that our impact on the EU policy towards the Belarusian citizens is minimal. So the conference for a new Belarus adopted a resolution on the Belarusian membership towards the EU, but one have to underline that it was done under some kind of pressure from European or Ukrainian politicians. And there was a kind of pressure, and this point was presented as one of the most important points for next cooperation with the Belarusian democratic forces. And as we see, such a resolution did not lead to greater cooperation. And we also follow the developments in Lithuania, where there are negative attitude and even xenophobic attitudes towards Belarusians in some countries, which is obvious in Lithuania. There is a number of publications. And so also when we talk about European law European legal acts towards Belarus, there is a question of the Belarusian independence and so on. So in the democratic forces actions, there are a few things that reflect the opinions of the Belarusian society inside Belarus. So if democratic forces were more dependent upon the opinion of the civil society, of the inside Belarus, domestic society, they would be raising more issues that are very important for the Belarusian society. So, and finally, so talking about strategic priorities and while talking about strategic approach and tactical approach, well, I think this split is not critical one. Both are needed. We should see European perspectives for Belarus and prepare all reforms, but without step-by-step approach and to do concrete things, it would not work. This is the last thing that I would like to mention. So these are organic things that should be compatible. There should be a strategy which also is combined with the action plan. So there is a number of tactical steps that enter into contradiction. For example, requiring to close Belarusian embassies in the EU countries. So while being silent on the closing of Russian embassies across the EU. So this is very weird. We should look more in detail on these issues. There is a number of controversial issues inside the Belarusian democratic forces. So, well, the strategic, in general, the strategic approach of rapprochement with the EU is important, and there are no contradiction with tactical moves as well. Many thanks. I wish you every success in continuation of your work.
Thank you, Vital. And now I pass the floor to Anatol.
Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. As a person with 30 years of experience working for the European integration, I definitely I'm supportive of this document. I join all the congratulations that have been pronounced earlier. On the other hand, I would like to join the discussion. Of course, we'll need to make some more notes to streamline this document, but generally there is a positive impression. I will add a few touches to this picture, what is called the European integration. We have to admit that the European narratives were present and quite a long time back in Belarusian politics. Of course, they were not so strategic for the majority of Belarusians. When we are talking about the European integration, I can say that part of Belarusian political parties were included into this process of integration. It is proved by the fact that several political parties, both leftist and right-center parties, were members of the European umbrella organizations, political organizations. It proves that European values were always present in Belarus. When we analyze the programs voiced during election campaigns, the European integration component was always present. However, there always been some kind of pragmatism. Let's see what Belarusians want in Belarus. I think it was a strategic mistake to follow what society thinks. Well, society acts based on some tangible values, some tangible issues. At the same time, my personal experience of free elections, I was the leader of the civil party. We participated in all electoral campaigns, and even my colleagues would tell me, Anatol, you are with these free elections. People are not interested. People need basic economic things. So I think it's important to understand here that the responsibility of certain political groups, expert communities, to perform this function of a driver, even when society doesn't, the majority of society doesn't support the, I really doubt that 15–20% of people are in favor of European choice. Well, when you talk to them about their right of free elections, free trial, fair trial, then they will say yes to the European values. That's why it's very debatable issue. I'm very happy that the declaration was passed in this configuration in Warsaw. More than 100 agents said yes. So this voice was the most outstanding, and it was heard in a significant number of European offices where decision making takes place. I would also like to note that the importance of the vision of a new Belarus, a positive alternative. I am part of this process. We are running a discussion so that to strengthen in a new Belarus this geopolitical choice of European perspective for a new Belarus. It would be crucial both for political actors in the Euro-Atlantic space, if it is enshrined in the constitution, but it also encourages all of us to work with people to explain why it is important. The war in Ukraine made this situation black and white. It gives us new opportunities, however surprising it may sound, to articulate further the European values. So this black and white contrast actually allows us to be more optimistic, understanding at the same time that we choose between war and peace. People, between light and darkness, people prefer positive moments. So developing a European legislation in line with the European standards is also one of the tasks for us. It's on our agenda, and I will give you an example of small optimism. We're working on one of the legislations on constitution of the new Belarus, and we have not only Belarusian experts, and one of the rectors of the university in Kharkiv first runs into a bomb shelter, and when he comes out, he works on our legislative drafts. You're optimist. I'm telling him, you're an optimist. You're under bombs in Kharkiv, but you believe in the European perspective of Belarus. That's why you're working with us. That's why this meeting is very important. I would like to say about the institutionalization that we are going to pass. There's a document being drafted on cooperation and between the European Union and democratic forces of Belarus. I hope that this document will be signed by European Parliament. It's important not only to express the stance, but to outline the positions when some documents are signed, documents on cooperation. It strengthens, it gives additional power to this document that was presented to us today, and also our European integration. And finally, I would like also to note such a factor: the Alliance for the Future Democratic Belarus looks at it as a tool which we can use to promote a European perspective for a new Belarus. A practical proposal for the authors of this document: we have 24 groups for Democratic Belarus in 24 national parliaments, and we disseminated to them as the list of experts and topics related to Belarus for them to choose, so that what they want us to organize online meetings for 1 hour meeting. If you are interested, we could also include you with your topics of this presentation. And for example, when MPs in Luxembourg or Germany or France believe that it's an important issue, you could also make presentations for the parliamentarians, for MPs in those countries. I think it's very important so that not only us and politicians and experts know about this document, but also it reaches the politicians in the European Union. And with this, I'd like to finish.
Thank you so much, Anatol. Rosa, you have your 5 minutes to for the final remarks.
Thank you very much for your cooperation, for your participation. I beg your pardon, my Belarusian is not perfect, but I'm trying to use it more and more. Thank you very much to the participants of the discussion, to experts, analysts, and politicians. And first of all, I would like to thank our partners. I mean the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, because this meeting, this presentation was made possible thanks to their support. And I also hope that in the future, moving forward, we are planning to continue our topic and this project. As far as I understand, we will also compare our experience, or let's put it this way, we compare the lack of European integration, or our experience of the lack of this experience, but we also can use the experience of Ukraine and EU-Ukrainian relations. I think it can be very useful for Belarus, as well as the experience of relations between Moldova and the European Union. I also hope that we will pay a lot of attention to these topics. Beg your pardon, I mix Russian and Belarusian when I speak. I would also like to announce in March, we are going to have an online seminar titled New Division Lines in Europe, Belarusians Across the Divide Line. It's a very painful and very relative topic for us. And it fits well into this tactical approach when we will look at the problems of Belarusians both inside and outside the country. I also hope that you will participate in our work moving forward. Thank you once again for your critical comments, for your additions, for your remarks. Thank you, Anatol, for proposing to make this presentation in the parliamentary groups which work with Belarus in national parliaments in the EU. We will be very thankful. Victoria, I believe that you share my interest and optimism on this. Thank you very much, Laure. We have been in communication with you on the topic for a long time, and thank you for this cooperation. And also big thanks to Paul and Kasia Glod. I'm confident that we will meet once again on this topic, because this topic is very relevant, both strategically and tactically. I really hope that we will have not only theoretical reflections or our thoughts, but also it will have a practical result, impact for Belarusian society and for our democratic forces. Thank you. Until we see each other again.